What? What? Libby asked him not to scream at him. He's not deaf, huh? And besides, he doesn't understand Korean. So the effect of the emotional delivery is lost in translation. Yeah, I imagine it would be. Yeah. Okay. Well, no, thanks. Okay. See you. March 3rd, 1952. For the longest time, you had supremacy. You had way more planes than the enemy. But those days are over, and you realize with dismay that the enemy now has more planes than you do. But what do you do if you can't produce them fast enough to keep up? You get creative. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, there was a huge riot at the UN's POW camp on Kojido Island. As many as 1,500 prisoners involved. The UN troops opened fire on them and killed dozens of them, and the total casualty number was over 200. Something will have to be done there to prevent more such violence in future, for it remains a deadly and explosive situation. A North Korean attack against Yangdo Island failed, and the US was accused by the communists of conducting bacteriological warfare. I also said that to try to get the communists from withdrawing the Soviet Union as part of the neutral nations Supervisory Committee, which is who will inspect and supervise things in Korea post an armistice. And side note, neutral only with respect to the Korean War. Anyhow, I said that UN Commander Matt Ridgway and UN Chief Delegate Turner Joy wanted to tell the other side that the Soviet Union being on the committee was unacceptable. And Washington said, well, let's exhaust other options before we say that. And they plan to offer to drop Norway from their choices for the committee if the communists drop the USSR from theirs. UN staff officers offer this option this week on February 25th, and you can guess how the other side reacts. They refuse to budge. Ridgway tells the powers that be that they have to make a firm stand. This is bullshit. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff talk to Defense and State, and then get President Harry Truman's approval to tell Ridgway he can make the refusal to accept the USSR firm, but there's this. Ridgway might proffer an alternative solution of the problem non-committally with the rejection if he thought agreement could be gained. They suggested that both sides select nations, regardless of their status in the Korean War, to man the supervisory organ and inspection teams. This would include the United States for the UNC side, and the communists could appoint the Soviet Union if they wished. Since this would divorce the Russians from a neutral designation, there was no objection to the Russians serving on, frankly, partisan organs. However, the communists show no interest whatsoever in forming any sort of non-neutral group for inspection and supervision. So the staff officers just drop it for now. There's been no augmentation of UN force, well, US force, during the lull in the active war over the past months. But there have been shifts around within command. For example, US 45th and 40th Infantry Divisions took over from 1st Cavalry and 24th Infantry Divisions. You might think, well, that sounds pretty routine, but such is not the case. Now, 45th and 40th Infantry Divisions were National Guard divisions, and last April, they were sent to Japan to finish their training. The U.S. Army asked Ridgway last July to confirm that he did not intend to send them to Korea piecemeal. I went over several months ago how many men and small units were brought over piece by piece and thrown into formations where they didn't know a soul, and it wasn't good for anyone, right? Well, the Joint Chiefs told Ridgway in August that they want those units in Korea when they finish their training. And he said, sure. But just after that, the summer offensive broke out, and he really did not want to swap savvy, combat experienced divisions for such newly trained troops until there was no longer danger of an enemy counteroffensive. He also pointed out that while such a transfer was in progress, it would severely impact his ability to defend Japan. Reuben Jenkins, U.S. Army G3, Assistant Chief of Staff for Operations, does not agree with this. He thinks the risk in leaving Japan more vulnerable temporarily is way less of a threat than Korea is. He also reminds Ridgway that a lot of the National Guardsmen finish their terms of service now in August and will be sent home. He said, how about We send one of the divisions over, and then, when the time feels right, withdraw a combat division and send the other one over. Last September, the President and the Joint Chiefs approved this. But Ridgway didn't. He thought the danger of a Soviet threat to Japan would last until at least November 15th. Remember, the San Francisco Conference was in early September, and there were still big worries what the Soviet reaction to the Japanese peace treaty was going to be, nor what it might all mean for the situation in Germany. So he suggested postponing any movement whatsoever until November, and then they'd revisit things, and he got his way. So November rolled around, and Ridgway continued to object to shifting the divisions, but for a different reason. The fall offensive was over, right? But Ridgway did not want to hurt 8th Army's combat effectiveness, just in case they needed to start operations to put pressure on the enemy at the negotiating table. Instead, he wanted the restrictions against using the National Guard troops as replacement troops lifted. Collins gave him a hard no. Doing that would imply that even after a year of training, the National Guard units weren't good enough for battle, and would also raise storms of protest in Congress. So that settled that. 45th Division began its movement in December to replace 1st Cavalry Division, and the transfer was done how they used to do it in the Pacific in late World War II. The arriving regiments of the division get off the ships and take over the equipment, the weapons, and the quarters of the units there, who get on the same ships and ship out. All the men have to carry is personal equipment. Over the month of December, the 6 regiments of 1st Cavalry all arrived, and by the time the last one arrived, the 1st had already seen combat. The swap of 40th Division for 24th begins in January and finishes in early February, whereas the regiments of 45th Division were not all assigned to the same corps. 40th takes over 24th Territory in 9th Corps Zone near Kum Song. Ridgway might have gotten his way over that, for a while anyhow, but this week he does not get his way concerning POWs. On February 27th, Truman decides to not heed Ridgway's arguments, and instead greenlights the removal from POW status for any prisoners held that might violently resist repatriation because of their fear of consequences that could happen should they come under enemy control once more. So, if the communists reject a deal whereby repatriation is voluntary, which the UN wants, in exchange for being allowed to build or rebuild airfields in Korea post-armistice, which the communists want to do, then Ridgway is to remove the names from the POW lists, and then once that is done, say that UN command is willing to agree to all-for-all repatriation of POWs. This would be the final U.S. position, and one full of intriguing possibilities if it were used. For it would mean that the UN command would be utilizing the enemy's own tactics in handling the prisoner of war problem unilaterally. How the communists would react to this turnabout was unknown, but one thing was certain: they would protest loudly and at length. By the beginning of March, then, the negotiations on item 4 of the peace talks agenda have come down to just voluntary or forced repatriation. Once the principle is decided, the details should be easy enough. But there are no signs the communists are willing to abandon their hard stance against any form of voluntary repatriation, no matter how it is disguised. As for the UN, while it seems that maybe full voluntary repatriation may be unattainable, they are toughening up on the issue. And negotiators have been allowed to hold out for no forced repatriation and might just release all the non-repatriates one day. Lord knows how this is going to work out. Hey, you want to know something? In February, the staff officers met 22 times to discuss the POW issue. But despite all their efforts, forced repatriation still remains as the main bone of contention, no closer really to a solution than it had been at the start of the month. So what happens now? The sub-delegations reconvened for a series of meetings with a similar lack of success. Admiral Libby pressed for the exchange of sick and wounded prisoners, for the delivery of POW packages, and for formation of joint Red Cross teams to visit the camps. But Major General Lee Sang-cho would not consider a piecemeal approach to a settlement. Lee charges that the UN plans to hand over Chinese POWs to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist China on Taiwan, and not to Mao Zedong's communist China, where the Chinese volunteer army technically comes from. He also has a pretty good fountain of propaganda from the POW riot last week on Kojido Island. In fact, Lee became so enthusiastic in his work that Libby had to ask him not to scream at him. He was not deaf, the admiral declared, and besides, he did not understand Korean, and much of the effect of the emotional delivery was lost in the translation. One thing that's not lost on anyone is that while the UN may not have been beefing up their forces in Korea, the communist side sure has been. U.S. Army G2 intelligence chief Alexander Bolling is, well, as always, busy making estimates and judgments. And he is well aware the communist forces have used the quiet time of the war since July, when the peace talks began, to expand their military presence in the skies. He estimates they had about 500 planes last July and have well over 1,000 now, and some 800 of those are Soviet jets. This is planes based in Manchuria, across the border with China. Despite this increase, however, they haven't really made any serious attempts, yet, to seriously challenge UN air power. In December, with far fewer planes, they flew some 4,000 sorties, but now it's down to under 3,000 a month. Since the new year began, they haven't even bothered to keep the North Korean airfields serviceable, and they rarely fly planes further south than Sinanju. So while their air power exists, they prefer to, in general, keep it as latent power. Of course, Ridgway and his staff are still deeply concerned about communist air power growth. Heck, back in December, he told the Joint Chiefs he needed a total of at least 8 F-86 Sabre jet wings just to keep bare numerical par with the enemy in terms of fighter interceptors. At the time, he had 5 squadrons of such planes, which is a wing and 2/3, 3 squadrons in a wing, right? Fighter squadrons generally operated with 16 to 24 or so airplanes, while bomber squadrons might have 12 or more. Units like the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing were equipped with F-86 Sabres and had a total strength of around 75 planes, though maintenance often kept a third of them grounded. However, since current US Sabre production is 13 a month, it would be impossible to give him 6 1/3 more wings from home. Canada makes 20 of the planes a month, but that's entirely committed to NATO. Well, since they cannot physically accommodate Ridgway's request, the Joint Chiefs try to work something else out. They were planning on sending a carrier to the Pacific in January, so he could have that. And a Marine jet squadron was also supposed to go to the Western Pacific in January, so he could have that too. The U.S. Air Force staff also has a couple of suggestions. Like, at home in the States, Air Defense Command has 3 squadrons of F-94 Starfire all-weather fighters that they thought could be spared for Korea, but it would mean sending over pilots who'd already served a tour of duty there. They also think that they might negotiate the release of 75 F-86s in Britain and 75 in Canada, which could then head for Korea, provided there were crews available. But that would not only really delay the buildup of NATO forces, but strip Canadian air defenses to the bone. Under the circumstances, however, both Air Force and Army planners agreed that Ridgway did fairly urgently need more air power. How has this all worked out? Well, he has gotten some modest augmentation by now. One of those 3 F-94 squadrons was sent over in February, and the U.S. government is talking with the Canadian government about buying 10 Sabres a month until they have 60 more. So by June or so, he'd at least have 2 operational wings and a 50% reserve. The carrier I mentioned, the Philippine Sea, did arrive as scheduled, which is great, but U.S. Chief of Naval Operations William Fechteler says it can't be a permanent fixture unless the Navy could keep using 2 carriers that are due for retirement under a current reconversion program. The Air Force says, hold the phone. You don't have to do that. You can just transfer 2 carriers from the Atlantic Mediterranean theater temporarily. Defense Secretary Robert Lovett rules the Navy can hang on to those carriers, though, as long as there is no sign of imminent settlement of the Korean War and there's a threat that it might escalate. He is very much against reducing American forces in Europe, considering the political ramifications of doing so. President Truman agrees with this, so he tells Ridgway he can keep the extra carrier until there is a truce or such time as his air power is built up that he won't need the carrier so much anymore. So that has had a bit of success for Ridgway. But how about his request for more AA battalions, anti-aircraft? Last summer, U.S. Army Chief of Staff Lieutenant Joe Collins agreed to a 5-battalion increase, and by November, 4 of them had arrived in Korea. But with the increase not only in enemy air power the past few months, but also in UN airfields that require defenses, Ridgway wants more. In January, he asked for 5 more battalions to be sent over as soon as possible, and this did not go as well as with the planes. Collins told him in no uncertain terms that there were 0 anti-aircraft battalions that could be spared. The U.S. simply has too many other commitments around the world. And here are a few notes to end this 8-day week of the war. Leap year in 1952, not in 2026. The communists may not be launching record numbers of sorties monthly, but they are breaking records. Remember last week, the largest number of MiG planes in the skies in one day of the war was spotted. Well, that number is broken February 27th when 404 MiGs are spotted during the day over northwestern Korea. For the month of February, 17 MiGs were shot down by Sabre pilots, while 2 Sabres were lost. Here are some other numbers for February. 8th Army sent out an average of 13 patrols per day, 8 of them at night, and most did not make enemy contact. In fact, only 1 of the last 185 night ambush patrols made contact with the enemy. And the week ends. With the POW issue still the thorniest sticking point in negotiations, the U.S. really worrying how they're going to get enough planes to Korea to keep up with the enemy. And while the troops don't do much actual fighting, they do get moved around. Well, sure, troops have been moving around and will continue to do so. But will they actually make more attacks? The front lines are starting to look like a scene from World War I with all the trenches and all. And neither side has shown an inclination to cross the November demarcation line in force. U.S. 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet has said straight out that even minor attacks are not worth the cost. Ridgway, knowing that Truman and Washington wish to get out of the war, sends a cable to the Joint Chiefs on March 1st detailing his reasoning and his conclusions. This is it. A major ground offensive in Korea, having as its objective large-scale destruction of hostile personnel and material, would require acceptance of a serious risk of successful enemy counteroffensive, which could inflict heavy material and personnel losses on our own forces. Even if our operations were successful and hostile counteroffensives were defeated, the operations would still exact heavy U.S. battle casualties. Employing all forces available for this effort, the operation, even though successful, could do no more than deal a hard blow to communist forces. It could not inflict a decisive military defeat. Without substantial organizational reinforcement, a major ground offensive would offer too marginal a chance of success to justify its undertaking. So, they can't beat the communists in the field. They can't solve the POW issue at the table, and they're getting more and more outnumbered in the skies. That is the situation in early March 1952. It must be frustrating for everyone involved on all sides. And hey, here's a side note completely out of left field. A little announcement for any of you who happen to live in Sweden. A feature film just recently came out in Sweden called Katriket, or the Cat Kingdom, which I mentioned for 2 reasons. One, I have a cameo near the beginning of the film, which is nice. But also, a song I wrote long, long ago is the music over the closing credits. I actually wrote the song in the 90s. The song is called Deliverance and was released by Southside Stalkers 20 years ago. That's the version that the film uses. So all you Swedes, go and see Katriket. It is actually a really good movie, too. It's a dark, absurd comedy drama. And hopefully for everyone else, it will come out globally so all the rest of you can see it. As for the Korean War, I will continue to cover it as it develops, however it develops, and I can do that thanks to the Time Ghost Army. It is the Army that allows us to do all of our productions, and you too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Jared Dale Abraham. That's a cool name, isn't it? Yeah? Pyro agrees. Jared Dale Abraham is the Army Member of the Week at this channel. These are the newest commissioned officers. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.